evening, everybody, and thank you so much for the kind invitation. Thanks to all of you for coming, for showing an interest in the topic we are then hopefully to discuss. I personally am not that much looking forward to the lecture. I have a rough idea of what I'm going to say anyway. I'm always more interested in the subsequent exchange, and I mean, we can discuss everything. I don't promise I have all the answers, but definitely I will not. But it's good that all the things that you consider important in that broad field can be put on the table. Let's see what we can make out of it. I have divided my speech into 3 chapters. The organizers kindly gave me some leeway what precisely to do, and of course it will be somehow related with the title of the conference, but it's maybe a little bit more political. So I will basically describe some current trends that I see in the international discussion on freedom of religion or belief, problematic tendencies. And that's the second part. Maybe the second part is the main part of the lecture, but before doing that I will have to at least briefly sketch an understanding of freedom of religion or belief. So that's why I start with freedom of religion or belief as a human right. Sounds trivial, is not trivial, as you will then see. And then after the second part that describes some also problematic tendencies under the title here, authoritarian twists of freedom of religion or belief, I will then end in a somewhat more positive note, because I do see also the potential for bringing together, coming up with a new consensus of, on some of the controversial issues. I do see now a particular opportunity for that. We will see. Okay, to make it easy and not to start with lots of definitions, what human rights are, what freedom of religion are, I would like to quote, to start with a quote that most of you know. I mean, it's maybe the most famous sentence of any international human rights document whatsoever. The first sentence of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1948 Declaration. I mean, you have heard it repeatedly. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And in a nutshell, that is the problematic profile of human rights in general, and also of freedom of religion or belief more specifically. And from that quote, I have taken 3 interconnected principles. I mean, they're all there. It's pretty obvious, pretty easy, but I don't want to spend much time on these conceptual questions. First, all human beings. All human beings, right holders are human beings, which means universalism, normative universalism. That's the basic principle on which the entire architecture of human rights rests. All human beings are entitled to have their basic rights respected. And that's why, let me give you one more quote. I won't quote a lot, but one more, and that's the first sentence, which I even like more. The first sentence of the preamble of the UDHR, and the first sentence starts with recognition of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. I mean, the first word of the first sentence of the preamble of the first international, the mother document of international human rights protection, is recognition. Recognition of what? Of human dignity, of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. That's where it all starts. That's the basis, the axiomatic insight. Recognition, not an act of recognizing one another mutually, but an insight. It's deeper than acts of recognition. Yeah? So human dignity, and that's the basis of normative universalism. Okay, what does it mean? I mean, human dignity should be protected in rights, and there are lots of rights, but all of them have a strong component of freedom. I would even go as far as to claim that all human rights basically are rights of freedom, but that would require a little bit of caveat, some extra quotes. So let's make it easy and say at least they have a strong component of freedom, and freedom is one of the principles running through the entire system of human rights, including, of course, freedom of religion or belief, like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. But also the habeas corpus rights have the element of free choice of a lawyer, of one's own lawyer, right to marriage, of course, free marriage, free choice of a spouse. I mean, that freedom component really runs through the entire system. Of course, I mean, freedom is not unlimited, but the decisive point is the following. Those who want to impose restrictions on a right to freedom, they have to bear the burden of argumentation. And the burden of argumentation is not the end of the story. I mean, there are even criteria that one has to meet before restrictions can possibly be justified. Yeah. So, but freedom, it's very. I mean, it's really carved out, and then in international law. And of course, freedom is inherently connected with equality. Human dignity, or rather, is the equal dignity of all human beings. And that's why, I mean, those elementary rights that are supposed to institutionalize the due respect for the inherent dignity of all members of the human beings are naturally equal rights. So equality, and closely attached to that, closely connected with that, non-discrimination is another principle running through the entire system. And all these principles are interlinked. They are not just a combination, but they really shed light towards on each other. I don't want to go into philosophical questions. As I promised, I make it very short, although in fact I like to indulge in philosophy, but not here too much, unless you want it, and then we can discuss on everything. Now let me briefly apply this to freedom of religion or belief, and then you see already how complicated things are. Oh, no, that's wrong. Universalism. Freedom of religion or belief. If you take universalism seriously, what does it mean? What does it mean? Something it does not mean, for instance, something that you find in many constitutions across the world. Typically, they have some provisions of freedom of religion or belief. But then, I mean, if you have a closer look, it means you can be a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, full stop, end of story. Yeah? Many constitutions, not only in the Islamic world, but also in China, in Indonesia, in Russia. Yeah? I mean, they spell out the options that you have, and you have limited options. Yeah? Not even the options of have all the options equally, by the way, and to choose really freely. Yeah? So, taking now universalism seriously, taking the human rights-based approach seriously means you have to turn it the other way around. The starting point must be the self-understanding of human beings in the broad field of religion or belief. And the self-understanding of human beings in that broad field can be very diverse. Beyond any, let's say, predefined options, you can be this, that, and then it's all. Yeah? That's why freedom of religion or belief, as a consequence of its universalist nature as a human rights, must have a very broad application. It's broader than what many people think when hearing the short formula of freedom of religion or religious freedom. I mean, the whole title is freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Very broad, covering human beings' deep convictions and concomitant individual and communitarian practices. And the UN committee in charge of monitoring the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the 1966, one of the big covenants, including its Article 18 on freedom of religion or belief, made it very clear, stating 20 years ago that freedom of religion or belief includes theistic, non-theistic, atheistic beliefs, as well as the right not to profess a religion or belief. And then it goes on saying it protects traditional religions, but also new religions, large groups, but also small, tiny groups, very often negatively branded as sects. I mean, and all this broad application follows from universalism. If you take that as a starting point, it's a natural implication. I mean, that can lead then to very complicated questions where the line must be drawn. I'm not going into that, but if you want to discuss it, we can do it later on. Yeah? Of course, one has to protect freedom of religion or belief becoming lost in trivialities, and that's why sometimes definitional questions come up. But the starting point is always what people are, what they are, who they want to be seen. So their self-understanding, that's the starting point. It's not always the end of the story. Sometimes one has to have a closer look and also maybe challenge some self-descriptions. Okay, now freedom. Freedom, again, as I said, it's not unlimited, but it's also very broadly defined. It's in the field of freedom of religion or belief, freedom to search for meaning, freedom to come to most different results, including to no results, freedom to communicate one's own conviction, freedom to join together with others, to form communities, new ones, but also to retain in old ones, into traditional practices, of course, I mean, quite naturally I include it as well. Freedom then also to educate one's children in the spirit of one's own faith. So all these questions of education, of socialization, freedom to build up institutions, to establish community life, to have an infrastructure, communitarian aspects as well as individual aspects, freedom not to be exposed, freedom also to change, but freedom to retain, freedom to do it in private and have it respected as a mere private affair, or freedom to manifest one's belief, one's convictions, one's faith in public, in the public sphere, together with others. So a very, very broad panorama of different freedoms, of course not unlimited. The forum internum dimension even has absolute protection. So no restrictions whatsoever can be legitimate, no forms of indoctrination, for instance, including indoctrination of children in school. I mean, that's not a theoretical question only. The forum externum, I mean, when some religious manifestations have an effect on the external world, maybe also on the social coexistence with other people, okay, then they can possibly justify restrictions, but only if those restrictions meet criteria such as a legal basis, then a legitimate aim from a list, from an exhaustive list of legitimate aims, and they must in addition be proportionate, non-discriminatory, I mean a list of criteria. Finally, equality, non-discrimination, that also implies complicated questions. I would claim the following: if you take non-discrimination seriously in the field of religion or belief, it's in a way, and I'm using a somewhat vague language here, implies some relation between the state and religions in which the state does not simply take side. So some sort of, let's say, disentanglement, some sort of an open, fair, inclusive framework in which the state makes sure that different religious or beliefs can live, and not one only being officially recognized at the expense of equal treatment of others. So official religions or state religions are not prohibited in international law, but I would say state religions, wherever a state has an official religion, the state has at least to carry an extra burden of justification and argumentation that this does not lead to de jure or de facto discrimination, that this does not lead to distinguishing between first-class citizens, those adhering to the official religion, second-class citizens not doing so. Yeah, so, and that, I mean, at least, I would say, from its inherent logic, makes it plausible to set up secular constitutions. I mean, I know secularism is a very controversial field, and we had the discussion briefly today in the workshop this afternoon that, I mean, in fact, we have different forms of secularism, different secularisms, different concepts of secularism. But I would say some inclusive, open form of secularism at least makes a lot of sense from freedom of religion or belief, and all those forms of coexistence in which the state then really takes side, supporting one particular religion or belief system at the expense of equal treatment of others, raises at least critical questions. Okay, now that was the first part. As I said, a very general outline of what it means that freedom of religion or belief has the status of a human right. So it really incorporates this, this structure, these three interconnected principles: universalism, freedom, equality, in that field of religion or belief. Now, let's move to the second part. Okay, authoritarian twists. And now it becomes a bit more political. It becomes more political because I want to give you some examples, 4 examples, in fact, of tendencies, quite relevant tendencies, not academic discussions only, but politically relevant tendencies of turning freedom of religion or belief into something else. So losing the human rights focus, or at least blurring the conceptual contours of freedom of religion or belief as a human right, while still using, let's say, human rights rhetorics. It's something that you can observe also in other fields. Human rights remain contested. I mean, everyone also politically, almost everyone, agrees to human rights language. Yeah, but sometimes, I mean, the language becomes very fuzzy, very unclear, and there's a certain tendency to develop human rights rhetoric that moves away from a meaningful human rights concept. And I think that is particularly true in the field of freedom of religion. And I give you 4 examples. The first is, perhaps, if we are lucky, a historic example. Because currently the discussion has a little bit, or the controversy has been put aside. I'm referring to more than 10 years of fierce fighting in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, in the General Assembly, in other bodies, over resolutions aiming at combating defamation of religions. That started in the late 1990s. It peaked during the Danish cartoon crisis, as many of you might imagine. And now, maybe it's over, but it's not completely clear yet. Those resolutions were put on the table by the organization of the Islamic Cooperation, as it now calls itself. I mean, it used to be called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, but since a year it's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a body of 57 member states. I mean, the resolutions were mostly presented by Pakistan, and I mean, the general purpose already comes to the fore in the title. Yeah, combating or fighting, eliminating, overcoming some negative attitudes and negative manifestations against religion. Something that may hurt the feelings of believers, and I think you clearly know what I have in mind, like, for instance, the recent Mohammed video that has triggered an outcry, or previously the Danish cartoons, Geert Wilders with his film Fitna, incidents of that nature, very often targeting Islam, but possibly targeting other religions as well. And so there are concerns, there are understandable concerns underneath. Nevertheless, those resolutions had a quite problematic authoritarian tendency. And I mean, let me just limit myself to mentioning 3 problems. The first was a certain bias. I mean, it basically dealt with Islamophobia plus a number of other phobias. Islamophobia, which is, by the way, a quite relative phenomenon, a quite huge human rights challenge. Islamophobia, but then also Christianophobia, term hardly known in our region here, and anti-Semitism, sometimes replaced by Judeophobia. But that was all. So the list of three phobias, and within, throughout a decade, I don't know how many resolutions were tabled. Never ever, for instance, Baha'iophobia came up. And the Baha'is, I mean, it's a religious minority whose members really suffer from harsh and life-threatening persecution, in particular in Iran, but not only in Iran. Yeah? So it never occurred, never ever, Baha'iophobia or other phobia, Jehovah's Witnesses phobia, yeah? Or atheism phobia. I mean, you could imagine other phobias, but it really was Judeophobia, Christianophobia, and particularly Islamophobia. As I said, relevant phobias, but nevertheless a certain bias. Was the first problem. The second problem was, I mean, if you think of Pakistan. Pakistan, nowadays, a country torn by religious conflicts, partly, by the way, due to its heritage of dictatorship. Pakistan was a very different country 40 years ago. Different countries. And there's a potential one should not forget. Potential also for improvements. But nowadays, I mean, the relations between different groups really are poisoned. And Pakistan is also quite known for maybe the harshest anti-blasphemy legislation that we have on the globe. Ill-defined blasphemy offenses, no one really knows what it means, ill-defined, non-defined, even can lead to a death penalty. And we have quite a number of convictions. No one was actually executed, but I mean, it really had a threatening, a chilling effect, an intimidating effect in Pakistan of, in particular, members of religious minorities, but also maybe critical Muslims. Yeah? So, and now you certainly see a connection between fighting defamation of religions and then blasphemy law. But that was, for many of the countries, the natural answer. And now giving blasphemy legislation, authoritarian blasphemy legislation, a sort of, how shall I call it, human rights rhetorical backing, I mean, really could lead to problematic results on the ground, but also to lots of conceptual misunderstandings. And then, the last point, in this context, freedom of religion or belief itself, I mean the human right, was in danger, was sometimes in danger of being remodeled, reshaped into something quite strange, into the anti-right to freedom of expression. Yeah? So freedom of expression, like, that's the green light. You can speak out, you can even provoke, you can write caricatures, draw caricatures, and so that opens up a variety of positions. Green light, freedom of religion, stop sign. Yeah? So a human right that is less liberal, perhaps, in which the freedom component then might finally be even lost out of sight. Yeah? And that's a dangerous tendency. During the cartoon crisis, the Mohammed cartoon crisis, when there was a session also, a discussion in the Human Rights Council, my predecessor, Asma Jahangir, by the way, who stems from Pakistan, Asma Jahangir made it very clear that freedom of religion or belief is not the, let's say, counter right to freedom of expression, but those rights are closely intertwined in a positive sense. They are not completely identical, but they basically move in the same direction. Rights of freedom, rights of communicative freedom. Yeah? With freedom of speech, it's very clear, but freedom of religion also has a strong component. And she made it also clear that there's no such thing as a right not to be criticized, for instance. I mean, a human right not to be criticized, not to be provoked, would be the end of free interrelations, of free discussions, of free speech, of freedom in general. So she defended it. And as a result, her name never came up as a reference in any of those resolutions, which is a good thing, which is quite a good thing. Now I move to the second example. Another name did regularly occur, and that was the name of the then special rapporteur on racism. Racism. I mean, he was the main reference source in all the defamation or anti-defamation resolutions in the last couple of years. I mean, that shows a tendency that religious questions, or questions of freedom of religion or belief, are sometimes systematically put into the context of fighting racism. And I would say for understandable reasons and also for good reasons. I mean, we have obvious examples of overlaps. Take the example of anti-Semitism. What is it? I mean, sometimes it has to do with Jewish religion, disrespect for religious practices, but clearly anti-Semitism also stands for one of the most brutal manifestations of racism. Okay, we see that. Islamophobia, again, I mean, also lots of overlaps between religious discrimination but also racism. We can see that. On the phenomenological level, this makes a certain sense. But, on the other hand, there is a danger that something important gets lost out of sight, and that finally, religion itself is increasingly ethnicized, with problematic consequences. Meanwhile, a couple of years ago, the UN even established an ad hoc committee discussing an amendment to the UN Anti-Racism Convention to now include also questions of religion. So again, religion is put in a close context of racism, and again, there are empirical reasons, political reasons for doing that. The problem is, I mean, if you end up with seeing religion like an ethnic characteristic, like an ethnic group characteristic, what will easily be lost out of sight is the component that people can change. They even have a right to change. I mean, some would claim, okay, you can also change your ethnicity. Okay, ethnicity, I mean, those concepts are a little bit fluid. It's not always clear. But with freedom of religion or belief, you have a right to change it. And you have not only a right to change your own religion, you have also the right to invite others to do so. And that's something you cannot possibly apply to questions of racism. You cannot meaningfully invite another person, please consider changing your skin color. Sorry for using that maybe rude example, yeah? Or other ethnic characteristics. So then in the end it looks like religion is just a collective marker of a group of people at the expense of an element which I would say it's more than just an element. It really, I mean, it marks the human rights nature of freedom of religion, the freedom nature of it. And that's the right to change, the right to convert, the right to do non-coercive, respectful missionary activities. And I have to insist on this because, as a matter of fact, I would say at least 30% of the states in the world do not respect it. I mean, sometimes there are even criminal provisions against missionary activities, against what is typically labeled proselytism in lots of states, not only in the Islamic country, what is sometimes labeled the Islamic world. You find it also in Greece, for instance, anti-proselytism legislation, or in Russia, in quite a number of countries across the globe. In India, on the state level, anti-proselytism laws, anti-conversion laws, even, yeah? But in particular in the Islamic world, I mean, there is a strong tendency to prohibit or to create at least obstacles to missionary activities, including by criminal law provisions, and sometimes even to punish converts themselves. I mean, it remains very controversial, but at the same time, it's part even, I would claim, of the conversion, part even of the forum internum component of freedom of religion or belief. I can tell you I had just a month ago, 5 weeks ago, my presentation in New York to the General Assembly on exactly that topic. It didn't go well. I mean, the thematic focus of my annual report was on the right to conversion as part of freedom of religion or belief. Did not go well. And that's why, I mean, one really has to pay a lot of attention. Now, let's move to the, no, it's a bit complicated. number 3. Hoppla, oh. So, number 3. All right, good. You see strange acronyms. FORB, you might have gathered, is freedom of religion or belief. And many of you will know what LGBT means. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual persons. So it's a sort of acronym for a new generation of rights for receiving respect for one's sexual orientation and gender identity. It's a new tendency. It remains controversial, in particular on the global level, to a much lesser degree in Europe. LGBT rights. And now, sometimes, you see I have a question mark there, and that's the most important thing. But sometimes, freedom of religion or belief is not presented as the counter-right to those new generation of rights. Like it was the case, maybe still is the case, in the earlier example of defamation of religion or belief, the counter-right to freedom of expression, freedom of wrong perception. Hopefully made it clear enough, a completely wrong perception. And now, but we have a similar perception, and increasingly so. On the level of litigation, there are now complicated cases, very complicated cases, including in the Netherlands, but also in the UK. The Strasbourg court is currently dealing with a case in which a registrar, evangelical registrar, refused on conscientious ground to participate in homo marriages. And she was dismissed from her office, dismissed from her position. Quite harsh reaction. She challenged it, and that's currently pending at the Strasbourg court. I mean, those questions are extremely complicated, and there are no easy solutions. And one has to take very seriously all the human rights issues at stake and talk to people. And I can imagine, I mean, the pictures can be very, very different. But now, what is increasingly noticeable is a tendency to politicize those questions. I mean, not only to deal with individual complicated reservations, which people then have also maybe religiously motivated objections, but really to turn that into an ideological battlefield. And it's something you observe on the regional level, but also increasingly at the international level. So the question of whether you are pro or con LGBT rights becomes now a marker of collective identity. Yeah? And so I first saw that at a conference, at an OSCE conference in Vienna 2 years ago, the Organization of the Cooperation and Security in Europe. They regularly hold conferences also on the humanitarian dimension. And there, some ultra-conservative religious organizations stood up claiming the very fact that gays and lesbians nowadays can have respected positions in public life is a violation of our freedom of religion. And that, of course, is highly problematic. I mean, that persons have conscious-based reservations to be actively part of it. Okay, that's something I would consider very carefully. But those ideological claims harbor an enormous risk. And it's even worsening. I mean, I attended another humanitarian meeting of the OSCE just recently, a few years back in Warsaw. And then some groups of post-gays came out. Post-gays and ex-gays claiming we are now victims of discrimination triggered by the predominance of the LGBT mafia. Okay, I mean, life can be very complicated. I have seen so many things. There's nothing I would consider completely impossible. Yeah? But now, the problematic point is, how did they present it under the umbrella of freedom of religion or belief? Yeah? And that's something very, very dangerous. Like a few years back, when many saw an antagonism rising between freedom of expression, freedom of religion, with the tendency of seeing freedom of religion as something anti-liberal. Now you see the same thing in that even more ideologicalized battlefield. You see it. So ex-guys claiming we are discriminated. I always speak with people. I would always listen to what they have to say, but there was a political agenda, quite obvious. Quite a number of those groups claiming their anti-LGBTI stand in the name of freedom of religion and belief. Yeah? And I've seen it also around the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, sometimes homophobic tendencies being claimed as part of freedom of religion and belief. Institutions, I mean, that's different if institutions do it than if individual persons have their religious-based reservations. That's different. Again, that now requires a careful and at the same time quiet response. And part of the response must be freedom of religion or belief cannot be turned into an ideological weapon against the LGBT community. That's not possible. It's possible that people express their personal reservations. It's possible that people claim they don't want to be involved. They can conscientiously object to be part of this or that. That's not possible. So we do have conflicts. But, I mean, a sort of political antagonism would really destroy the human rights basis. And some go as far as to say you have to decide either freedom of religion or belief or anti-discrimination legislation. And just imagine what that means. I mean, I started freedom of religion or belief as a human right here, non-discrimination being part of the human rights agenda, very strongly so. I mean, an architectural pillar of the human rights system in general. Now, if you turn freedom of religion and belief against anti-discrimination agenda, in particular their LGBT parts, you really come into very difficult waters. And now, as the flip side of that, now many people become, let's also, including the so-called progressive parts of the human rights movement, become increasingly suspicious of freedom of religion or belief. And that brings me to the last tendency, freedom from religion. I mean, that's, sometimes people claim what we need now is not freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. Yeah? Okay, the answer, it has always existed. Nothing new, because freedom of religion or belief means if it's a right to freedom, okay, you can do it and you have the right not to do it. You can go to church, but you can have the right not to do so. You can stick with your traditional beliefs, but you can also change it. You can manifest your convictions publicly, but you can also insist not to be publicly exposed. So it's not something new. I mean, it has always been there. But now if it's propagated as something new, something seen in isolation, then it can also be turned into a, let's say, anti-liberal rhetoric. Now from a completely different angle. Now from maybe a part of society of people who call themselves secularists. Sometimes I call myself secularist. It depends on what that means. But we have then an ideological understanding of secularism. Secularism not, let's say, as a constitutional arrangement. Secularism not as a political fairness principle, to have a society inclusive, open, fair, non-discriminatory, open to everything. Yeah, okay, no first-class, second-class citizens. Yeah, but a sort of secularism as an ideology, as a comprehensive doctrine, post-religious doctrine, and then freedom from religion, or as some would prefer to call it negative freedom of religion, then is turned into something against all public manifestations of religion. And then again, I mean, it gets, can easily get an anti-liberal drive. And we see that happening. To give you one example, it's not my favorite example, because I suffer a lot from it. The current discussion you all are aware of in Germany on male circumcision. It's again a very complicated topic. And one can have different opinions, different assessments, and also from a human rights perspective, okay, it's not easy, But what I see now is that, I mean, also in the Cologne judgment, the only reference made to freedom of religion is we have to protect the child against his parents. So the state has to intervene on behalf of a child in order to secure the negative freedom of religion. And and some go as far as to say we should also protect children from being baptized, of being religiously socialized. Yeah? And so that, I mean, there are different facets of what I would then also call an authoritarian twist of freedom of religion, in which then only the negative component, only the component of privacy, only the component of freedom from religion comes to the fore, and the rest is pushed aside. Yeah? So that, again, is a tendency that, yeah, I think we can observe as a growing tendency. And maybe the last sentence on this, what really worries me is the observation that even within the human rights community, many human rights committed people show an increasing unease when it comes to freedom of religion or belief. Everyone is in favor of freedom of speech, okay, very clear. Yeah? Everyone in favor of freedom of assembly, very clear. Anti-discrimination legislation, but freedom of religion or belief, some people feel insecure, a certain degree of unease. And I really see that also when dealing with this issue on the NGO level, that, I mean, many of the large, more secular NGOs don't even show up. That's a tendency. Now, let me finish on a more hopeful note towards a new non-authoritarian consensus, again, question mark. I very much hope we can find it. What do I have in mind? That relates to what I said earlier. It relates only to one thing, to the defamation of religions resolutions that I described. I don't have to repeat it. Resolutions that finally protected the reputation of religions rather than the dignity and freedom of human beings. That's to make it in a very sketchy way. Now, interestingly, we have a window of opportunity opening up currently to overcome that tendency for quite a number of reasons. Yeah, maybe Pakistan lost parts of its reputation. It was really quite surprising when participating in the March session 2011 of the Human Rights Council, the discussions of freedom of religion or belief. I was expecting now Pakistan again to table a resolution on defamation of religions. It didn't happen. Instead, two names of individual persons were mentioned by many delegations, and those were victims of assassinations in Pakistan due to their resistance or opposition to blasphemy laws. Salman Taseer, previously governor of Punjab, his family was even there, and Shahbaz Bhatti, member of the cabinet in charge of minorities. And those names came up, and they were very, very present. And then when finally Pakistan took the floor, surprisingly, no mention of defamation of religion. I mean, that may have played a role. Instead, then the OSIC tabled a new resolution, that's Human Rights Council Resolution 16/18, and that's now the new reference document. The title is extremely complicated. But the point is, it's now not about the reputation of religion that should be protected, but the topic is religious stereotypes. Negative stereotypes that might incite hatred. So religiously motivated or religiously oriented hatred. Hatred targeting human beings. That's what we have to look at, rather than protecting the reputation of religions. I mean, that resolution went by consensus, found unanimous consensus, and now serves as the new reference document. As I said, the title is so complicated, I wouldn't even try to memorize it, but it's easy to memorize at least the names. 16, 18, everyone who knows about religious wars in Europe, European history, 30-year war, can easily memorize that. That plays an important role as a consensus resolution now. At the same time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, organized a number of workshops in all regions of the world dealing with incitement to hatred. The OIC countries were always there. I mean, we had workshops in Vienna, in Nairobi, in Bangkok, Santiago de Chile, and recently in Morocco, focusing primarily on a so far hardly even known, largely unexplored article, Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that deals with advocacy of national, racial, religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. So not only speech, but speech that intends real harm. And how to do that? How to answer. And I mean, it was really worked through. How can we get innovative, efficient, and non-repressive responses to crises like Quran burning, Mohammed videos, but also provocations targeting other religions. And then the United States, Hillary Clinton herself, met with the Secretary General of the OIC, of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation in Istanbul, and they triggered what is now called the Istanbul process, trying to fill the frame opened by Human Rights Council Resolution 16/18. And that started in the State Department last year, December last year, and now there's a series of conferences how to really put flesh to the bones. And the most recent one is now the Radboud Plan of Action of October 2011, again on the very same question. And now, my last two sentences. The answer is a twofold one. Very, very limited space to criminal law provisions. Let's move away from blasphemy laws. I mean, that's very clear. With the OIC states have maybe still mixed feelings about it, but the arguments were put on the table. We don't need blasphemy legislation. We may still need criminal law provisions against extreme manifestations of hate speech, those that can really trigger violent actions, the very extreme ones. But that's only a very limited space, and it must be, all those provisions should be connected to a high threshold. And so what we have to do is, we have to become creative. We have to find alternative solutions. And the charm now of this new plan of action is that it really gives examples of what can be done. And for instance, the most important response to hate speech is more speech, not restrictive measures, more speech, alternative speech, so that maybe target groups of hatred feel we are not left alone. We are not left alone. There are people, civil society, but also maybe parts of the political elite who express sympathy. We are not left alone, and that's why it's not upon us to take the law into our hands, because no one else would defend our cause. No one else understands us. Everyone is just laughing at us. Yeah? So that really makes an enormous difference. So media work, more representation of minorities, religious alphabetization also for media, school education, civil society, creative initiatives, dialogue initiatives, and I mean there's a panorama of activities that has been also now laid down in the Radboud Plan of Action, which is now publicly since 2 weeks, so it's really brand new. So we have an opportunity to create a new consensus. We have an opportunity also to move away from repressive measures, but I mean that's an opportunity that we really have to use. If we don't use it, if we don't fill that frame, then maybe in a year or two we might simply be back again at square zero with the old defamation debates. So let's work together. Thank you very much.